Detective Sarah Mitchell never expected that a routine cold case review would unravel the most shocking conspiracy of her career. On that cloudy Tuesday morning in March 2024, she opened the file marked Henderson Missing Persons 1997, expecting another dead end. Instead, she discovered a web of lies that had kept 2 children hidden from the world for nearly 3 decades. The story began on July 15, 1997, when 7-year-old Emma Henderson and her 9-year-old brother Jake were traveling with their parents Michael and Rebecca on what should have been a peaceful family vacation to Lake Tahoe. The blue Toyota Camry was packed with camping gear, swimming suits, and the excited chatter of 2 children who had been looking forward to this trip for months. Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit Mr. Hoppy while Jake read his favorite superhero comic books in the back seat, completely unaware that this would be the last normal day of their childhood. Michael Henderson sat behind the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather surface. His dark brown eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, not to check traffic but to look at his children one last time. Rebecca sat beside him, her auburn hair falling in waves around her pale face. Her green eyes were rimmed with red from crying the night before when they had made their final decision. She twisted her wedding ring nervously around her finger, a habit she had developed during the months of planning what they were about to do. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, the Hendersons stopped at a remote gas station 30 miles outside of Reno, Nevada. The Desert Rose Gas and Go was exactly the kind of isolated location they needed for their plan to work. Security footage later showed Michael filling the tank while Rebecca went inside to pay and buy snacks. But what the cameras did not capture was the second vehicle that had been following them for the past 50 miles, a black Suburban with tinted windows that pulled up to the far pump. Thomas Garrett stepped out of the Suburban, his weathered face scanning the area for any potential witnesses. At 55 years old, Garrett had the appearance of a successful businessman with his expensive suit and polished shoes. But beneath his respectable exterior, he operated one of the most sophisticated child trafficking networks in the western United States. His organization specialized in making children disappear without a trace while their parents collected insurance money, and his clients received healthy young children with no questions asked. Garrett had been planning the Henderson operation for 3 months, ever since Michael had first contacted him through an encrypted message board where desperate parents could find solutions to their problems. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: stage a car accident that would supposedly kill the children while actually transferring them to a wealthy family who had been waiting years for the perfect match. The children remained in the car, windows down, enjoying the warm summer breeze, completely unaware of the adult conversations happening around them. Emma had been drawing pictures in her coloring book while Jake practiced reading aloud from his comic book. They were typical children, full of energy and curiosity about the world around them. Emma had recently lost her first tooth and was excited about the tooth fairy, while Jake was learning to ride a bicycle without training wheels. What happened next would haunt investigators for decades and destroy the innocence of 2 children forever. According to the elaborate plan that had been rehearsed multiple times, Michael and Rebecca were supposed to create a distraction while Garrett's associates quietly removed the children from the vehicle. The operation required precise timing and careful coordination between multiple participants. Rebecca walked into the gas station convenience store, her hands shaking as she approached the cashier. She purchased 2 bags of chips and some bottled water, items they would not need because they were not actually continuing their journey to Lake Tahoe. The clerk, a teenager named Danny Rodriguez, later told investigators that the woman had seemed extremely nervous and had difficulty counting her money. He also noticed that she kept checking her watch as if waiting for something specific to happen. Outside, Michael finished pumping gas and walked slowly around the vehicle, checking the tires and looking under the hood. His movements were deliberate and calculated, designed to give his accomplices time to approach the car from the blind spot created by the gas pumps. 2 men dressed as mechanics emerged from behind the service bay and walked casually toward the Toyota Camry. Emma looked up from her coloring book when she heard footsteps approaching. She saw a man in coveralls walking toward their car and assumed he was there to help her father with something mechanical. Jake noticed the man too, but was more interested in his comic book than in adult activities. Neither child felt any immediate danger. They had been taught to trust adults and had no reason to suspect that these men meant them any harm. The first man reached through the open window and spoke softly to Emma, telling her that her parents had asked him to take her and Jake to get ice cream while they finished with the car. Emma hesitated because she had been taught not to go anywhere with strangers, but the man showed her a photograph of her parents and claimed they had sent him specifically to find her. Young children are naturally trusting, and Emma believed the man was telling the truth. Jake was more suspicious than his sister and asked to speak with his parents before going anywhere. The second man, who had positioned himself on the other side of the car, told Jake that his parents were inside the store handling an emergency and needed the children to come with them immediately. The urgency in the man's voice convinced Jake that something serious was happening and that he needed to protect his little sister by cooperating. Within less than 3 minutes, both children had been quietly removed from the Toyota Camry and were walking toward the black Suburban with the two men. Emma held her stuffed rabbit tightly while Jake kept looking back toward the gas station, expecting to see his parents. The men assured the children that they would be reunited with their family very soon and that this was all part of a surprise that their parents had planned. The children were placed in the back seat of the Suburban, where they found blankets, pillows, and snacks that had been prepared specifically for them. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice introduced herself as Aunt Mary and explained that she was going to take care of them during a special adventure. The children were given juice boxes that contained mild sedatives designed to make them sleepy and compliant during the long drive ahead. Meanwhile, Michael and Rebecca completed their part of the deception by returning to their Toyota Camry and driving exactly 5 miles down Highway 95 to the predetermined location where they would stage the fake accident. Michael pulled over to the shoulder and both parents got out of the vehicle for the final time. They placed animal bones that had been prepared by Garrett's organization in the back seat, along with accelerant that would ensure the fire burned hot enough to destroy any evidence. Michael struck a match and threw it into the car, stepping back as the flames quickly engulfed the interior. The fire spread faster than either parent had expected, and for a moment they wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. Rebecca began sobbing as she watched their family vehicle being destroyed, knowing that this moment marked the end of their lives as parents and the beginning of an elaborate lie that would last for decades. The flames reached the gas tank, causing a small explosion that sent smoke high into the desert sky. Within minutes they could hear sirens approaching as other drivers had reported the fire to emergency services. Michael and Rebecca composed themselves and prepared to play the roles of grieving parents who had just lost everything they cared about in a tragic accident. When the first responders arrived, they found Michael and Rebecca Henderson standing beside their burning vehicle, covered in soot and tears. The couple told a heartbreaking story about how the car had suddenly started smoking and how they had barely escaped with their lives. They claimed they had tried desperately to save their children, but the flames had spread too quickly and the heat had been too intense. Their performance was convincing because their grief was real, even though its cause was different from what they claimed. The fire department worked for hours to extinguish the blaze, but the damage was catastrophic. The vehicle was reduced to a twisted metal frame and ash. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found what appeared to be the charred remains of 2 small bodies in the back seat, along with fragments of toys and clothing that the parents had planted as evidence. The heat had been so intense that traditional identification methods were impossible. DNA testing in 1997 was not as advanced as it would later become, and the samples recovered were too degraded for definitive analysis. The forensic team collected bone fragments and dental remains that appeared consistent with children of Emma and Jake's ages. The medical examiner ruled the deaths accidental and issued death certificates for both children based on the physical evidence and the parents' testimony. Michael and Rebecca Henderson were devastated, or at least they appeared to be. They held a memorial service for their children at the local Baptist church, where over 200 people came to pay their respects. The small white caskets contained only personal items and photographs, since there were no actual remains to bury. The entire community rallied around the grieving parents, raising funds and offering support during their darkest hour. But what the community did not know was that Michael and Rebecca were not grieving the death of their children. They were mourning the loss of their parental relationship and struggling with guilt over what they had done. Late at night, when they were alone, Rebecca would sometimes break down crying, not because Emma and Jake were dead, but because she would never see them grow up. Michael dealt with his guilt by drinking heavily and becoming increasingly isolated from friends and family members. The insurance companies processed the claims within 6 months and paid out a total of $400,000 to the Henderson family. Michael had been careful to purchase the policies from different companies to avoid suspicion and had used legitimate medical records and school photos to support the applications. The money provided temporary relief from their financial problems but could never replace the emptiness they felt from giving up their children. Thomas Garrett's organization had meanwhile transported Emma and Jake to a safe house in Northern California where they spent several weeks being prepared for their new lives. The children were told that their parents had been killed in an accident and that they were very lucky to have been rescued by kind people who wanted to take care of them. They were given new names and new birth certificates and were taught to never mention their previous lives to anyone. Emma, who was renamed Elena, was placed with Harold and Martha Morrison, a wealthy couple in their 40s who had been trying to adopt a child for over 10 years. The Morrisons owned a successful furniture business in Bend, Oregon, and had been approved for adoption through legitimate channels but had grown impatient with the lengthy waiting process. When Garrett offered them a 7-year-old girl with blonde hair and green eyes, they asked no questions about her origins and paid his fee of $50,000 in cash. Jake, who became James, was placed with the same family because Garrett's clients had specifically requested siblings. The Morrisons had always wanted 2 children and were delighted to welcome both Emma and Jake into their home. They were told that the children had been rescued from an abusive situation in California and that all records of their previous lives had been sealed by court order to protect them from their biological family. The Morrison family provided Emma and Jake with a loving, stable home environment that was far better than what they had known with their financially struggling biological parents. Harold Morrison was a patient man who taught James how to fish and work with his hands, while Martha Morrison was a former teacher who helped Elena with her studies and encouraged her artistic talents. The children quickly adapted to their new lives and within a few years had no clear memories of their time as Emma and Jake Henderson. The case was officially closed within 6 months, classified as a tragic accident with no signs of foul play. The lead investigator, Detective Raymond Foster, was nearing retirement and had no interest in pursuing conspiracy theories or complicated explanations when the physical evidence supported a straightforward conclusion. Foster filed his final report and moved on to other cases, never suspecting that he had been deceived by an elaborate criminal operation. But Detective Sarah Mitchell had always been suspicious of closed cases that seemed too neat and convenient. Something about the Henderson file bothered her from the moment she opened it during a routine review of cold cases involving missing children. The witness statements were consistent, almost suspiciously so, and the timeline of events seemed too precise for a chaotic emergency situation. Most troubling was the fact that no one had ever adequately explained why the gas station security camera had malfunctioned for exactly 17 minutes during the time the Henderson family was there. Sarah decided to take a fresh approach to the case using modern investigative techniques that had not been available in 1997. She began by creating a detailed timeline of the Henderson family's activities in the weeks leading up to their supposed deaths. What she discovered painted a troubling picture of financial desperation and family dysfunction that had not been adequately explored during the original investigation. Multiple neighbors reported that Michael and Rebecca had been under severe financial strain in the months leading up to the trip. Their home was in foreclosure and Michael had recently lost his job at a local manufacturing plant where he had worked for 12 years. Rebecca had been working part-time as a waitress, but her income was not enough to cover their mounting debts and basic living expenses. Several witnesses mentioned heated arguments between the couple, often centered around money and their uncertain future. More disturbing were the reports about the children themselves that had been overlooked or dismissed by the original investigators. Emma and Jake had been happy, healthy kids, but teachers at their school had noticed some concerning changes in their behavior during the final months of the school year. Both children had become withdrawn and anxious, with Emma starting to have nightmares and Jake developing a stutter that had not been present before. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's second-grade teacher, told Sarah that the little girl had begun drawing pictures that showed families being separated and had asked several times if children ever had to live with different parents. Jake's fourth-grade teacher, Mr. Williams, reported that the boy had become increasingly aggressive with classmates and had been caught stealing food from other children's lunch boxes as if he was worried about not having enough to eat at home. Sarah also discovered that Michael Henderson had taken out substantial life insurance policies on both children just 8 months before the fire. The policies totaling $400,000 had been purchased through a broker named Vincent Carrera, who specialized in high-risk clients and had a reputation for not asking too many questions about his customers' circumstances. When questioned by the original investigators, Michael claimed the policies were a routine precaution recommended by his financial advisor, but Sarah found no evidence that he had ever consulted with any financial professional. The broker Vincent Carrera had died of a heart attack 3 years after the Henderson case, but his business records were still stored in a warehouse in Las Vegas. Sarah obtained a warrant to search through the files and discovered that Michael Henderson had not been Carrera's only client seeking large insurance policies on children. Over a 5-year period, Carrera had written policies worth millions of dollars for families whose children later died in accidents or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. As she dug deeper, Sarah found inconsistencies in the official timeline of events that should have raised red flags during the original investigation. The gas station attendant who had been working that day remembered the Henderson family, but his account differed significantly from the police report. Danny Rodriguez, now 38 years old and managing his own auto repair shop in Reno, still had vivid memories of that afternoon because it had been the most unusual customer interaction of his career. Rodriguez told Sarah that Michael Henderson had acted nervous and agitated while Rebecca seemed unusually quiet and distant, almost as if she was in shock or under the influence of medication. Most intriguingly, he remembered seeing a second vehicle, a dark SUV with tinted windows, that had arrived at the station shortly after the Henderson family and had left around the same time. The occupants of the SUV had not purchased gas or entered the convenience store, but had remained in their vehicle watching the Henderson family throughout their visit. This detail had never made it into the original investigation file, despite Rodriguez having mentioned it to the responding officers. Sarah tracked down Detective Foster, who had retired to Arizona and was now 71 years old. Foster claimed he had no memory of anyone mentioning a second vehicle and suggested that Rodriguez might be confusing details from different incidents. But when Sarah pressed him for more information, Foster became defensive and ended the interview claiming he was too old to remember details from cases he had worked decades earlier. Sarah was convinced that Foster had either been incompetent or corrupt during his investigation of the Henderson case. She requested the original physical evidence from the fire scene and was shocked to discover that most of it had been destroyed in a warehouse fire just 2 years after the case was closed. The fire had been ruled accidental, but Sarah found it suspicious that evidence from several high-profile cases had been stored in the same facility that had conveniently burned down. Only a few small items remained from the Henderson evidence, including some metal fragments and what appeared to be bone samples that had been stored in a separate location for potential future DNA testing. Sarah arranged for advanced DNA testing using modern techniques that could analyze much smaller and more degraded samples than had been possible in 1997. The results were explosive and confirmed her suspicions about the entire case. The bone fragments did not belong to children at all. Further analysis revealed they were animal bones, likely from young pigs, that had been prepared specifically to mimic human remains. The bones had been treated with chemicals to accelerate decomposition and had been deliberately fractured to simulate trauma from a high-temperature fire. Someone with knowledge of forensic science had carefully staged the entire scene to deceive investigators and create the illusion that 2 children had died in the vehicle. Sarah now knew beyond doubt that Emma and Jake Henderson had not died in the fire, but she still had no idea where they were or who had taken them. She expanded her investigation to include known child trafficking organizations that had operated in Nevada during the 1990s. The research was painstaking and often led to dead ends, but eventually she uncovered references to a man named Thomas Garrett who had been suspected of involvement in several child disappearance cases but had never been prosecuted. Garrett had operated what appeared to be a legitimate adoption consulting service, but law enforcement agencies in multiple states had suspected him of facilitating illegal adoptions and possibly trafficking children to wealthy families who were willing to pay premium prices for healthy young children with no questions asked. His organization had been investigated by the FBI on several occasions, but Garrett was careful to cover his tracks and had never been charged with any crimes. Sarah discovered that Garrett had died of cancer 5 years earlier, but his criminal network had been extensive and had involved dozens of accomplices, including corrupt officials, medical professionals, and transportation specialists. Some of these individuals were still alive, and Sarah began the difficult process of tracking them down and trying to get them to cooperate with her investigation. The breakthrough came when Sarah located one of Garrett's former associates, a woman named Linda Walsh, who had served as a liaison between Garrett's organization and the families who were seeking children to adopt. Walsh was now 62 years old and living in a nursing home in Portland, Oregon, suffering from early-stage dementia that made her occasionally confused about time and circumstances. During their first interview, Walsh initially denied any knowledge of Thomas Garrett or his organization. But as Sarah continued to visit her and build a relationship, Walsh began to open up about her past. She revealed that she had been involved in facilitating dozens of illegal adoptions over a 15-year period, and that many of the children had been taken from families who were facing financial ruin or other desperate circumstances. Walsh told Sarah that Garrett's organization had operated like a business with specific procedures for evaluating potential children, identifying suitable adoptive families, and managing the logistics of transferring children while creating cover stories to explain their disappearances. The Henderson case had been typical of Garrett's operations, involving parents who were heavily in debt and children who met the specific requirements requested by wealthy clients. According to Walsh, the Henderson children had been placed with a family in Oregon who had been seeking siblings between the ages of 6 and 10. The adoptive parents had paid Garrett $100,000 for the 2 children and had been provided with fabricated documentation that supported their story about rescuing the children from an abusive situation. Walsh could not remember the exact names or location, but she was confident that the children had been placed together and had been well cared for by their new family. Armed with this information, Sarah began searching adoption records and missing person reports from Oregon during the late 1990s. She was looking for any indication that 2 children matching Emma and Jake's descriptions had appeared in the state around the time of their supposed deaths. The search was complicated by the fact that Garrett's organization would have provided the adoptive family with false documentation, but Sarah was persistent and methodical in her approach. Her investigation took an unexpected turn when she decided to search social media platforms for any trace of children who might match what Emma and Jake Henderson would look like as adults. She created fake profiles and began systematically searching through online photos and posts looking for anyone who might resemble the missing Henderson children. The process was tedious and often felt hopeless, but Sarah was determined to find the truth. 3 weeks into her social media investigation, Sarah stumbled across something that made her heart race. A Facebook post from the Riverside Community Center in Bend, Oregon featured a photo from a local charity event where volunteers were serving meals to homeless families. In the background, barely visible, were 2 adults who bore a striking resemblance to what she imagined Emma and Jake Henderson might look like 27 years later. The woman had Emma's distinctive green eyes and heart-shaped face, along with the same blonde hair that had been described in the original missing person reports. The man shared Jake's cleft chin and wavy brown hair and had the same athletic build that Jake had possessed as a 9-year-old boy. Both individuals appeared to be in their 30s, which would match the ages that Emma and Jake would be if they were still alive. The photo had been posted by Sandra Martinez, the events coordinator at the Riverside Community Center. Sarah immediately called Martinez and spoke with her about the charity event and the volunteers who had participated. Martinez confirmed that the 2 individuals in the photo were local residents named Elena Morrison and James Morrison, who were siblings that had moved to Bend about 20 years earlier. According to Martinez, the Morrison siblings had been active in the community for many years, volunteering at various charitable events and participating in local activities. Elena worked as an elementary school teacher at Bend Primary School, while James was a firefighter with the Bend Fire Department. Both were well-respected members of the community who were known for their kindness and generosity toward others. Martinez also mentioned that Elena and James rarely spoke about their childhood or family background and claimed to be originally from California. They had never been married and lived together in a house they had inherited from their adoptive parents, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. The siblings seemed to have a very close relationship and were often seen together at community events and social gatherings. Sarah's pulse quickened as she listened to Martinez's description. Elena Morrison's birthday was listed on her teaching license as July 23, 1990, making her exactly the same age that Emma Henderson would be. James Morrison's birthday, according to his firefighter personnel file, was September 15, 1988, which matched Jake Henderson's birth date perfectly. More importantly, Elena Morrison worked as an elementary school teacher, a career choice that seemed fitting for someone who had loved children and had been protective of her younger brother. James Morrison's job as a firefighter seemed almost ironic given his supposed death in a car fire, but also suggested someone who was drawn to helping others and preventing tragedies from occurring. Sarah needed concrete proof before she could move forward with her investigation. She traveled to Bend, Oregon and spent several days conducting surveillance on the Morrison siblings while trying to find opportunities to observe them closely and look for physical characteristics that might confirm their identities. What she observed convinced her that she was on the right track in her investigation. Elena Morrison had a small scar above her left eyebrow in the exact same location where Emma Henderson had fallen from her bicycle and required stitches just months before the supposed fire. James Morrison walked with a slight limp that matched the gait Jake had developed after breaking his leg in a Little League accident 2 years before the family's fatal trip. Both siblings had distinctive mannerisms and physical characteristics that matched descriptions from the original case file. The breakthrough came when Sarah managed to obtain DNA samples from both Elena and James Morrison through discarded coffee cups and napkins that she collected from locations where they had been eating or drinking. She submitted the samples for comparison against hair follicles that had been recovered from Emma and Jake's bedroom during the original investigation and had been preserved in the evidence locker. The results were undeniable and confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Elena Morrison was Emma Henderson and James Morrison was Jake Henderson. The children who had supposedly died in a car fire 27 years ago were alive and living under assumed identities in Oregon, completely unaware of their true origins or the elaborate conspiracy that had shaped their lives.